Hi, this video demonstrates the first milestone of our DevOps project, and our team consists of Deblin, Pratik, Ian, and myself, Kunal. The purpose of the project is to create an automated build workflow, wherein a push to the central repository would trigger an automated build and return the result of the build to the user. Our build server is able to build projects written in Node.js. So when a programmer makes changes to his Node.js module and finally pushes those changes to the remote repository on GitHub, we have a post receive webhook that is actually triggered and it notifies our build server. Our build server parses the notification to figure out which branch the change was made to. It then runs a branch specific build script. It checks the results of the build to see whether it was a pass or a failure, and it emails those results back to the developers. So let's see what our build server looks like. So this is the UI for our build server. It contains the link to the GitHub repository that we're actually working on, and also the build history for it. The build history contains the link to the log file for each build and the status along with the branch that it was built on. Now let's actually run a build and see how it actually works. So the first thing we need to do is which branch we're on. So currently we're on the dev branch. So let's make a change to the dev branch. So what I'm going to do is remove a comment, save it, and then push this to the repository. So I'm going to push this to the dev branch in the remote repository. And what it should have done was triggered the webhook, which would have notified our build server. And our build server in turn would have built the project and sent a notification about the result of the build. So let's take a look at the build server. So now if I refresh the build server, I should see a new row added. And as we can see, a new row was added for the dev branch and the build was successful. And this is the log file. So the log file says that the build was triggered via a GitHub webhook and it was building the dev branch. If we go down, we can see that it actually started the build at this point and the build was successful. And as the build was successful, it ran a post script which was to send an email to all the developers of that project. Now let's go to the email and check if we received a new email. So as you can see, we received an email from the build server for our project, which is called Complexity, and it specifies that it was a successful build for the dev branch. Alright, now let's go through the exact same process for the release branch, but for this experiment I'm going to ensure that the build fails by modifying the package. So we're on dev branch, let's move to the release branch first. Now that we did that, so let me just go to the package.json and let remove the braces so that now the build server is not able to load the dependencies and it will throw an error. And now let's go through the same process of pushing this to the server. So this time, as opposed to earlier, I'll be pushing it to the release branch of the remote repository. Now let's go back to the build server and let's refresh this page to see whether the build was successful or a failure. And as we can see, the build was a failure. This is what we expected. And when we take a look at the log, we see that the branch was a release branch. It started the build and then there was a problem here in which it said that there was an unexpected token in the file package.json, and that is exactly what we wanted to see. And it detected that the build was an erroneous build and it sent the same via an email to all the developers of the project. As we can see, we received an email from the build server specifying that our build actually failed for the release branch, and here's the log for the build. Now that we've taken a look at how our automated build workflow actually runs, let's go into details as to how it actually works. As I mentioned earlier, we have a GitHub webhook that actually notifies our build server upon a push to the repository, and this is configured via the project settings on GitHub. We can actually add a webhook to the project by specifying a server URL. In this case, that is the URL of our build server. And what GitHub actually does is, upon a push, which is the case for our post receive hook here, it is going to send a JSON file to the URL over here. Our build server then receives the JSON file that is sent by GitHub, parses it to figure out which branch the push was made to, and then it runs the corresponding script. So in the build server, you can see that in the scripts directory, we have two different scripts called build_dev and build_release, which are triggered based on the branch that we detect the push was made to. And if we see the contents of build_dev, we see that it actually checks out the dev branch so that we get the latest changes, and then it starts the build for that branch. And in build_release, we see that it checks out the release branch and again starts the build for that branch. So essentially we can do different things based on the branch that the changes were pushed to. Once the build is complete, the build server also has a way to trigger a post action based on whether the build was a success or a failure. It can actually detect whether it was a success or a failure, as we can see here. Under the dev branch, we have an if condition which checks if the error is not equal to null, which means that the build was actually an error. At this point, we can specify whatever action we want to do. For our case, we're sending an email. And if there was no error, which comes under the else part, it again sends an email. But if required, we can specify different actions for both cases. So that's the functionality of our build server. Hope you liked our work. Thank you for watching.